I want to welcome you to our session today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the students' level of autonomy relative to the framework. And before we get going, we're going to be looking at two things. We're going to have a poll everywhere, and you're going to need a phone or your computer to text into that. And you also, if you have a copy of the RSD framework, that will be helpful for you to reference as well. If you take a look, the links to the RSD framework and to the poll everywhere poll is in the chat. So if you have that open, you can, don't go there now, but there's the links for when you need them. So do you have them?
Just a minute, trying to see if I can find the chat.
If you look on the bottom of your screen, there should be some icons, and there should be a little bubble with 3 dots in it that says chat. Drag your cursor down to the bottom of your Zoom screen.
There we go.
So, Kristen, do you have a little, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, do you see a little bubble, like a comment, a think bubble? Can you click on that? And does the chat screen appear?
Yeah, she actually just sent a message in the chat screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't see it. Can you resend the link? I'll copy and paste them in.
Do you see them now?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right. All righty. So sounds good. So I think we're all set then. So.
All right. So that's just getting us set up for today. But before we dive in to the actual activity for today, I just want to do a little bit of community practice housekeeping. The first piece is just our timeline for the next few months. So our next meeting in a couple of weeks is a discussion-based meeting where we're going to be talking about some of the mapping activities that we're going to do in this module. But then after that, we're really going to be talking a little bit more about scoping projects and helping each other think through what those projects will look like, and you know, giving some IRB support if you haven't been down that rabbit hole yet in your life or at your institution. And we'll be doing that in December and into January. And then we'll pick back up with more content, digging into the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy starting in late January. So if you're a person who's doing a full-fledged project, you're going to be pretty active in the next couple months just getting prepped. And if you're a person who's been lurking just to hang out and join discussion and pick up tips here and there, don't check out if you want to pop in and give feedback. We love that, but you may want the break, and you have it if you'd like it. That being said, are there any questions or concerns with what's going on right now in the current module, or just how things are organized? I think we've caught a rhythm as a group. Okay, great. So moving into our content for today, we are looking at, you know, before we looked at the facets and we looked at it 2 different ways visually. We've seen it this way, and then we've seen it in the pentagon. And now we're going to start digging into these levels of autonomy and really getting kind of gritty interpretations of them so we can start using this to do our teaching and learning planning. So Sylvia is going to talk a little bit about how she uses the framework as a whole, and especially the levels of autonomy in her approach.
Yep. So if you take a look at the horizontal axis on your RSD framework, you can see that there's levels of autonomy going from very prescribed research to open-ended research. And it's really important that you understand that one level isn't necessarily better than another level. It's just what's appropriate for the learners at any given time. So if you're looking at an incoming freshman, something very prescribed might be appropriate. Likewise, if you're doing medical trials, you may have a very prescribed protocol to follow, and you don't want lots of people going off in different directions. So context is important in terms of levels of autonomy. With that being said, can you go to the next slide, Jessie?
Yep.
Thanks. With that being said, there's several reasons that I've found looking at alignment to be helpful. So one of them is taking a look at an alignment between assignments and assessments. So does the level of autonomy match when I do an assignment and as well as when I do an assessment? And is there a discrepancy between what I assigned and what's expected? And when we did our first community of practice here, I can tell you that 10 people sat around the table and laughed at ourselves because we went, whoops, there was a misalignment between our expectations and our instruction. So that was eye-opening for all of us. So that's the biggest one. Next slide, Jessie. The other thing that looking at levels of autonomy helps with is to look at what you're expecting students to do and looking at the assignments that go with your instruction. And so it calls into question about how much scaffolding are you providing with assignments? Is there a coherence between the assignments and the assessment? And also it helps bring to light the expertise blindness. So as I'm writing my assignments and the activities that bolster them, are my levels of autonomy something where I'm just assuming they know because I've got a lot of expertise and I can make those connections? And am I being fair to the learners by asking them to do those steps as well? So doing the levels of autonomy really helps make clear connections and the right kinds of practice and making sure expertise blindness doesn't play a role. Jessie, the next slide, please. Thank you. The other one that I found pretty important, it talks about levels of control. And I found this to be interesting as I started with the RSD framework because I heard instructors talk about how students weren't thinking independently and how they should really be able to start to problem solve and be critical thinkers, and they weren't, and they wouldn't take a chance. And then I started looking at my assignments, and I wanted my students to be critical thinkers, but I never gave them activities that went beyond the very scaffolded assignments. And so I was asking students to be independent thinkers while I was restraining the way the assignments were handled and how much autonomy they actually had. So like I said, one level isn't better or worse, it's just what's appropriate for the learner. And also as you reflect on what kind of learners you want in your classroom, make sure that if you want them to be independent thinkers, that the assignments help them practice independent thinking. So trying to figure out where I could or should give up control of scripted assignments this was a useful tool for me to figure that out.
Yeah, I like how you say figuring out where I should give up control, because what the tool ends up being is a very reflective visual tool where we can see, we can make more intentional choices about when we want to create really rich, robust scaffolding and how to remove those scaffolds carefully, and then what it might look like when those scaffolds are removed.
So any questions before we move on, or comments?
Okay.
Okay.
So,
go for it.
Yeah.
Nope,
So
go ahead.
what we're going to do is an activity that we have led in person with a team, with the fantastic colleagues we have here, that we've had the privilege of digging into the RSD with. And the first time we did this, we organized it as an actual kind of like geocache activity. And we have transitioned it into being a little bit more digital. But what you're gonna need is your RSD somewhere up where you can read through some of the actual text of it, because you're gonna be making some decisions about where you think some learning activities are based on the RSD. And we will give you time to read through, but I just wanna make sure you have it available to you, either in paper on your screen. And the first stop on our little geocache, our info cache, is going to be the embark and clarify and find and generate station. So what you're gonna do is watch the video that describes kind of a learning interaction or a way that students embark into research that from the perspective of a librarian, from the way that I end up interacting with them. And then we'll put up an assignment prompt, and what you're going to do at the end of this is vote which level of autonomy you think the students were being asked to work at. But I do want to clarify that it's just for the embark and clarify, find and generate piece of it. So right now, why don't you go ahead and pull up your RSD, and I just want you to read through some of the descriptions of what these levels, what they might look like in those two facets. I'll just give you a minute there. All right, you feel like you're somewhat familiar with the language, the descriptions, the criteria that it uses to move through the levels to define them?
Sure.
What do you think, Kristen? I know I'm still wrestling through levels of autonomy, and how people define what it looks like will still vary. Absolutely. Just like, per discipline, we kind of vary on how we define the facets even. We vary in how we define some of these levels. Okay, so I'll play the video and we'll go ahead and look through the lens of embark, clarify, find, generate.
When students arrive at the research help desk, they are asking for librarians to help them find information. They envision themselves at the find and generate stage of the research process. In reality, they're usually still struggling with the embark and clarify facet of research. They often don't have enough working knowledge in the area they're investigating or the information ecosystem in general to scale and bound their own research questions. Reference librarians serve as a translator between an open inquiry and a closed system of published and stored information, like a database or even the web. There are several common difficulties students have in finding information. They don't actually understand the assignment or the goal of the assignment. They don't have prior knowledge on their topic, and they don't know how to build a background knowledge. They don't understand how knowledge is organized, in general or in specific contexts, like different disciplines. They can't navigate our technical systems. For example, here's a common interaction at the research help desk. So, where can I find your books about children? Here, we'll take a look.
Okay, so I didn't find anything on hiking backpacks. Do you have any books on hiking backpacks for children?
Sure. Yeah, let's take a look.
I'm still having trouble finding what I need.
Okay. What is it that you want to know about backpacks and kids?
I need to know how much a child can carry in a hiking backpack at one time.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you can use the information?
So I have to write a paper for my industrial design class on hiking backpacks for children.
If we take a look at this request, this is how the student understands and is approaching their assignment. Write a paper is the assignment scope. Industrial design class is the context. Backpacks for children is the topic. So the goal is unclear or simply informational at best. But if you were to ask their instructor about the assignment, this is what they might say.
The assignment is to gather all the information needed to design a hiking backpack for children. They should probably start with investigating what kinds of materials to use.
So really, their assignment is this, in which case the librarian would find these. This type of interaction happens all the time at the research help desk. Students often struggle to verbalize their own information needs. Sometimes we don't realize our familiarity with these research tools is not on the same level as our students. Because of this, we need to remember to adapt to our students' level of understanding regarding information literacy skills.
All right, so I will go to the assignment prompt from the instructor, and you're trying to decide what level of autonomy the students are being asked to work at.
It almost looks like open-ended.
Justin, do you need a little bit more time to think about it?
I was actually thinking it's closer to bounded research because the professor seems to have an answer in mind that he wants the students to come up with and hasn't really told them where to go, just says, go to the library, find some books.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't say a specific book, but it still seems like, you know, he wants it from books and he doesn't want students experimenting with different materials and figuring out what to make the backpack out of.
Mm-hmm.
So he has an idea in mind of how this research should happen, but not, and a pretty good idea of what the answer should be, but yeah, isn't giving a lot of it's not quite as prescribed research because, yeah, there are multiple acceptable answers and multiple accepted sources that could be acceptable there. I could even see it be scaffolded as I'm thinking about it. But, yeah.
Well, let's kind of pick it apart a little bit. If you're just looking at the embark and clarify and the question the research task that they have to embark on, red says that the red column, which is prescribed, and explicitly from a closed inquiry. So not a lot of choice in what the question would be. All the way up to basically kind of choosing your own question and defining all the parameters of that question.
Right.
So Kristen, what you were thinking it was more open?
I was, well, in relation to the find and generate, I was thinking that. So yeah, not on the embark and clarify. That might be more bounded.
Yeah. Yep. So the way, and and you know, we all do perceive this. We just did this at a conference, and there was lively discussion about this. And some of it was wrestling with what do these definitions mean, and some of it was we just perceive instructions differently. But since the question is very defined, they don't have a choice. They're all designing this hiking backpack for a young girl. To me, it's landing either in prescribed or bounded. It's pretty closed. It's very prescribed. The clarify wiggles a little bit. So there are some pointers of how they might clarify it, and there's definitely a few criteria that they have to include. But I would say that not everything that they would need to do this project is clarified here, is mentioned here. They talk about materials is some clarification, and weight, but there's probably other considerations they're going to have to take into consideration when they approach this. But the find and generate, you're right, is totally open. There's no scaffolding here really about the find and generate. Actually, I might pull it back a little bit, because they are, again, clarifying enough that they know they have to find information on materials. They know they have to find information on kind of musculoskeletal development, but there's no instructions on how to find that information, where to find that information, except for down here. It says that the class discussion might be helpful. So there's a little bit of support there. What do you think, Sylvia?
So one of the things that I'm looking at in this is this idea of expertise blindness. So all of us can look at this and jump to the assumption that, well, people will have to look at materials, and people will, you know, maybe consider size of the individual or age of the individual. But that's where the expertise blindness comes in, because all of us can kind of make those assumptions, but it's not explicitly stated. So there are some students who probably can't make that jump, so it tends to be more open-ended. And if they can make the leap, then it leans a little bit more towards like bounded or scaffolded. But if they can't make the leap, then they're all the way over in open-ended, because they have no clue as to where to start or what sort of criteria might go into this.
For the find and generate?
Yep, so for the find and generate. So that's where, because expertise blindness can lead you to make lots of assumptions about what students know, and that's what aligning your assignment helps clarify.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we're having this conversation about where on the levels of autonomy it is means that we don't have an agreement, which means that students really won't have an agreement.
Yeah, it also means if this were and usually this is not the only thing handed to a student in order to accomplish something, but that there's a big gap between that prescribed embark and clarify and an unsupported find and generate step.
One thing that occurs to me when I see this, though, is that you know why our students go to Google, because if you type in that question, you will get answers, right? Mm-hmm. You will get something, you know, that matches that.
Mm-hmm. Which I tend to, as a librarian, I teach them that's the useful pre-search, I call it, where they're just kind of gaining the shape of their topic, and they're grabbing specific keywords they could use and what kinds of criteria they might use. So it's a useful step. They just usually stop there. Yeah. Okay, are we ready to move on to the next one?
Are you feeling a bit more comfortable with kind of how the levels of autonomy work? Dustin?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think the practicing is useful.
Yep.
Having to make choices.
Yep. So the next step on our info cache that we do is to look at the analyze and synthesize as well as the communicate and apply facets. So the routine we'll use in this one is going to be similar to what we just got done doing. We'll give you a few minutes to look at the analyze and synthesize categories and the communicate and apply. And then we'll provide you with a scenario and you can give us some feedback about what levels of autonomy you think the assignment is at. So, questions before we start?
I will say usually there is an evaluate and reflect and organize and manage step next, but our colleague, we haven't coordinated enough to get that video done yet.
All right, so take a couple minutes and look at the analyze, synthesize, communicate, and apply facets and what the levels of autonomy are like in those two facets. Are you ready?
Ish.
Are you okay?
Sure.
All right.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to EDUC 210, Impacts of Technology on Learning. We've spent several weeks defining learning, technology, and systems. Most recently, we've been talking about information processing systems. As you know from the syllabus, this unit meets our general education objectives for critical and creative thinking, analysis, and synthesis. It meets the course objectives by analyzing the intersection of current research in cognition, psychology, information technology, and technology systems. You've been introduced to the research skill development problem-solving pentagon. Today, we'll be focusing on our information processing assignment that asks you to analyze and synthesize your assigned reading, and then communicating your understandings through a drawing and a discussion. The idea is for you to compare human to human, human to machine, and machine to machine communication systems. By now, you should have read Chapter 8 in your text that describes human memory, forgetting, memory stores, and rehearsal. All of these help learners to retain information. You should have also read Hewitt's Information Processing Approach article. He draws a stage model of memory described by Atkinson and Schrippen for you that reinforces the ideas from your text. The Buzzle Information Processing Cycle reading provided you with a systems model that can be applied to both human and machine information processing and learning.
Hey, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Was that the right video?
It was part of it.
So at the end of the video, it describes what they're being asked to do.
So if you, yeah.
So why don't you describe what the assignment is then?
So if you if you recall those two drawings, there was a schematic diagram of the human information processing system.
Human information.
Right there. Okay, so on the left side, whoops. Oh, you're fine.
Impacts of
I'll get it. There it is.
There we go. Thank you. So on the left, you see Hewitt's information processing system. And that basically talks about how information goes into short-term memory, then how you practice it and it gets put into long-term memory, and then it's stored. So that's the way human beings process information. The list on the right is a system, and it's used for computers. So you got input, encoding, storage, processing. And what I ask students to do is to take those two models and draw for me, draw one item that condenses the two models into a graphic that compares human memory to machine memory, and then has them tell me how they're similar and how those two drawings align. So that's what I ask them to do. And so these are so basically they've done these readings, and then they come in and I say, great, you've done all these readings. Now please, in a group, discuss and draw one model that combines the two that will compare and contrast. So that's the assignment. And so you've seen what I've given them in terms of information. So if you take a look at that, and I want them to analyze and synthesize. So if you take a look at that, analyze and synthesize, what level do you think it's at? And then the same for communicate and apply. How much autonomy am I giving them?
I'm thinking bounded
Yeah.
for the analyze and synthesize.
Okay.
What makes you say that?
The structure is prescribed and the students are melding what they've learned into that structure, rather than, with the scaffolding, it seems like that tips it to generating new research paths and questions.
Yeah, I'm seeing that they're trying to bridge the gap between two models that are similar but different, and seeing what connections they can make there. But it seems like it's they're similar enough that I wouldn't quite call it scaffolded research at this point.
I would agree. The key word that jumps out at me is interpret. They're interpreting sources and then synthesizing them. Whereas once you hit scaffolded, the yellow column, they start to analyze trends and they think about it in terms of a task, appropriate to the task. And there isn't necessarily, to me, a task they're applying this to yet, kind of an outside task. The task is to integrate them. What do you think, Sylvia?
Yep.
Are we right? Okay,
so
and then communicate and apply.
One of the things that might be helpful is in the actual assignment when I do this, I give them specific terms that they need to match. So I tell them that they need to consider long-term memory, short-term memory, sensory memory, and compare that with input, encoding, processing. So I give them 2 lists of words, and I don't know if that will help you or not.
That changes.
That makes it sound pretty prescribed to me.
Okay.
See, that moves me from prescribed to bounded.
And that's a good question. So let's talk about why it is that each of you is moving to a different level, because I think that's probably more important than which level is actually there.
Mm-hmm.
So Dustin, why did my comments move you from one column to another?
So at this point, it seems like the students are being told which words to use to package everything together. So it's almost like, here are some words on one side, here are some words on the other, find out how they're connected, which there's not a lot of wiggle room there. They're definitely not trying to find.
So for me, the genre is prescribed because you're prescribing a drawing and some sort of summary, like a verbal summary, text summary. But in the red column in prescribed, it says lay language, which makes me think they can use their ideas in their own words. And in the orange bounded column, it says discipline-specific language, which I feel like you're giving them the discipline-specific language and making them use it.
Okay. So maybe this is one of those things where it lands on the line between red and orange.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Kristen?
Well, your clarification, I was between the yellow and the orange, so the clarification kind of bumped me into the orange solidly. It's interesting, though. I have a printout, and I'm not seeing that lay language that's in the red box.
There's a couple different iterations from Williston, so it really depends which copy you have. There's just a few verbiage tweaks. What does yours say?
In
the red box.
Yeah. Yep, it just says use prescribed genre to develop and demonstrate understanding to a prescribed audience.
Okay.
Apply to
nothing about language.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That makes a difference.
It does.
Well, mine says use prescribed language and genre to develop understanding and then develop.
Oh, there's like
oh, no.
a third one.
And so, yeah, because it says prescribed language, and that's what bumped me into the red.
We were all correct according to our RSD.
So having a common measurement tool is helpful as well.
One thing that I liked about this exercise, though, Sylvia, is that to me it really hit home that having something in the red isn't bad, right? Mm-hmm. Because at first you're like, oh, I don't want to put something in that level, but this was tremendously helpful for the students, I'm sure. And it's still a high level task, takes a lot of, cognitive processing and critical thinking. So that I really like this example for that part too.
Oh, thanks. One conversation I had with John Willison really spoke to that idea for me, which is, and I had wrestled with the framework for about a year, and he said you can have some really high level research that's prescribed, and you can have some really low level research that's open-ended. And it took me, I'm like, really? And he said, well, think about it. You have kids go out to the playground and play, and they're exploring how, why earthworms come to the surface when it rains or something. Nobody's really prescribing what they do or how they investigate. They're little kids out playing in the back, exploring, and it's totally unbounded research. On the other hand, you can have medical trials, which I mentioned at the beginning, where you can't have people deviating from the protocols. So you're researching cancer drugs, here's the protocol, it's very prescribed, you will not deviate, but it's very high-end research. It's just really prescribed, but it speaks to that idea that you were just saying, that, red isn't bad. And a lot of times when we do workshops, what I tell people is take your framework and take a pair of scissors and cut up the columns, and then just look at the red column, or just look at the orange column, or just look at the blue column, because one's not better than another. It's just which one works for any given scenario, and don't think of it as better or worse. Think of it as what's appropriate and what's aligning with assignments and things like that.
I would say that very discovery is a primary threshold concept in learning how to use the RSD.
Yay!
Yay! And it's a great time to remind ourselves again that it's not a rubric. I think we can say that a lot of times, but still orient ourselves towards the RSD as if it were a rubric, and it's really, really not.
So, and it's a fine point, but it's an important point. So, great.
Sylvia, we've done our job.
Yay! We could go. We're done.
Yay. Okay. Any other aha moments before we move ahead?
I'm in the back of my mind, I've just been trying to think of how to put this in the context of the class that I'm teaching now and will be teaching again next semester, and what I want to do next semester that's different. And I think it's so I think what they've been doing, and definitely in their previous classes, and unfortunately too much in the class that I am, because I see my classes, giving the students the skills helping the students develop the skills to push a little bit further. So not into better things, but into more independent things. But I think that as I'm thinking about this, I might have to start the semester with some red activities and then push them more orange and maybe yellow by the end of the semester.
Yeah, and if you isolate which facets you really care about, that'll be even more effective, because in 13 to 15 weeks, I'm not sure you can move very savvily up to even yellow in every facet.
Yeah, well, and the biggest things that I see are as shortcomings in the courses it currently is constructed is in the Embark and Clarify. So that's probably where I'm going to put most of my energy.
That's the other aha that usually comes out of this, is the Embark and Clarify is harder than we think.
Yeah.
It's a skill. Yep. Cool.
Yeah, and that it's also making a lot of work for me, because it means I have to scaffold a lot of things for them instead of just saying, here's some stuff, go research it.
Yeah, and slowing down. We kind of want to go through that step really quickly in our classes, because we feel like we have to get through a full iteration of the research facets, or that we have to do it all at the same level of autonomy or the same level of skill. And it's just, frankly, it's just too much for the students. And then they get lost in what they're actually supposed to be learning, I feel like, because their stuck points kind of overshadow everything else. Yeah, good luck with that. I can talk widely about this as a librarian. It does not have to. Does not have to carefully scaffold 15 weeks of instruction for students who have varying levels coming in. That's the other hard part is, they talk about teaching students in the proximal zone, which is basically that place that meets just challenging enough and what they've already mastered. And when it comes to research skills and communication skills, that's widely varied when they come into. So that's tough. That's really tough. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about, at the beginning, Sylvia talked about how she uses the levels of autonomy and the RSD as a whole. And I'm going to talk from a librarian's perspective, what I see in it, and kind of how I use it as I'm advising folks. So a big part of my job is to consult with instructors and actually departments to integrate research and information literacy skills. In a good day, I get to talk to them about the whole scope of their integration. On a fun day, but not quite a satisfying day, I only get to talk about maybe one assignment that's not working for one professor. So I look a lot, I look a lot from an instructional design perspective. That's part of my background. So here are the common issues that I want you to keep in mind as I talk about how I maybe use them when I consult. And one issue that Sylvia mentioned is alignment. So alignment is simply, are the learning objectives and the assessments matching, and do the learning activities actually bridge the movement between the two? Are they calibrated? And then cognitive load, which is simply, are students asked to learn too many things too fast? I just talked about the proximal zone, and the proximal zone is that sweet spot, really, that will bridge what they already know with the new challenge that they're ready to tackle. And that's, if you can be in that, supporting that proximal zone for each individual student, that's where the cognitive load is just perfect. It's just perfect. But that's really hard to do. And then scaffolding, which is simply how we support them through the learning activity. A lot of the scaffolding is in the learning activity, whatever learning activity we choose. And so, yeah. So the levels of autonomy, to me, are actually descriptions of scaffolding. So they're descriptions of types of support. And we know that well scaffolded, carefully scaffolded instruction lessens the cognitive load, is how I look at it. So I talked a little bit about what I see at the reference desk a lot, and Dustin, what you just kind of honed in on too, is that especially first, second, even third year students, they don't have any context for scholarly communication or the end goals of research processes in that kind of that wider information ecosystem. And so they have no idea how to scope and clarify their own topics. And they don't have any information, they don't have a lot of information or understanding of their content area either.
So one thing I can add to that comment, when we first started doing the RSD framework here at Stout, there was 5 instructors who asked our students, where do you think you are on this framework? Mm-hmm. And they all ranked themselves as at the level 5, open-ended researchers, and their justification was to put Jesse's comments in perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm in the open research level 5 because I can go to the library on my own and find a book. So that's the perspective that students are using when they come at this framework. And we don't give them the framework anymore. We did the first year, but they have no idea even of their own limitations or their skill levels. So that's pretty interesting too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how do I use the RSD as a librarian in a consulting mode? First of all, when I get the privilege to sit down with instructors, I can pull it out, and it's a way to establish some shared language about what those facets mean for them in their context. It's a way to visually, and I have here diagnose maybe some of the stuck points of students, why they're not moving where the instructor is hoping that they're going to move. And then designing some sort of intervention. So if the problem is that the embark and clarify, the student was just told, choose a topic. with no direction about what kinds of topics might be successful, might satisfy the end goals. Looking at it from the RSD, we can say, oh, that we were, we were assigning that at the open-ended, and they're not ready for that, and there's no scaffolding, so now we're gonna pull it back. So that's really nice. And then on the front end, using it to design learning interactions, it's nice because you can, from creating those learning objectives, so looking at what active verbs you're using on Bloom's taxonomy, you can use the RSD to reflect nicely upon that, and then looking at are those objectives aligned with the assignment, and then when you're creating the learning activities themselves, you can more visually, intentionally choose what level of scaffolding you are putting in those learning activities. So maybe you want a piece of it to be more open-ended because the point is for them to experience the messiness of research. But at least that's intentionally chosen. And I would say like reflected upon usefully, so they can learn from that kind of canned failure, that purposeful tough spot failure. So I use it as a mapping tool either way, whether I am looking at the piece of instruction from the back end and trying to figure out what's not working, or I'm designing the instruction from the front end. Any reflections upon that? So, oh, go ahead, Kristen.
So what does that look like? You know, like I'm following you, but I'm trying to picture that kind of interaction or discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What does that look like? Well, I would say a tool I use a lot when I walk into a meeting with instructors who are asking for some input, or who actually what probably more happens is we get a question at the reference desk that we can't help the students answer. And we notice that the assignment is maybe not even doable, right? So like the professor has required that the student find a physical book, but we don't have any physical books that help answer their research questions. So we know there's a disconnect somewhere. So I contact the professor and ask to sit down and chat about how we can help the students succeed. And a lot of times into those meetings, I have a sheet that has a few very traditional learning objectives that I see. So one of the learning objectives I see a lot is, the student will locate a scholarly article. Well, I've worked through all of the skills and mindsets, the dispositions necessary in order to find a scholarly article. And you and I know, and I would say when we kind of use these tools to remove our expertise blind spots, we all can see that finding a scholarly article actually requires quite a few cognitive abilities that are implicit. And we just kind of assume that they can just go do that because it's a task that we do easily. And I have that one learning objective on one side, and they flip it over and they see the full page of dependent learning objectives or abilities that are necessary to do that skill. And so I just talk a little bit about cognitive load first. And then I will pull out the RSD as a visual and kind of explain how it works and ask them to, if I have their physical assignment in front of me, I might work through saying like, what level, does this seem to be at, and what level do you want it to be at? And then talk through maybe some ways they could bring it to the level they desire. Or maybe we're finding out they're asking for students to perform too many facets in a 1 week period or a 2 week period. So it's just kind of that reflective tool. I don't always use it the same every time. Does that help?
That helps a lot. Yep.
Okay.
Jessie is very good at asking critical questions, and she does it with me. She still does it with me. And every time I'm like, oh, I got this mastered, she'll ask me another question. It's like, oh,
I'm sorry.
got more stuff to learn. But it's one of the things that really helped, and I think was an aha moment for a number of us, is when she pulls out the list of skills, sub-skills needed to do the assignment. So there was a number of us looking at our assignments going, why can't the kids just, all I got to do is go look up one source at the library. How hard can that be?
Everybody's all salty about it.
Yes, it's sort of like, come on, all you got to do is walk to the library and type in a couple of words and it's there. How hard can this be? And Jessie very politely and subtly pulled out her checklist and just said, let's take a look at all of the skills that are embedded here. And then there's this list of 25 things. And we're all going, oh, so it's not just go to the library and find a source. It's tied to, determining what's a scholarly source and determining who has credibility and what's credible, and the list goes on and on. And so what started out as Jessie said, kind of a salty conversation, ended up with us eating a bit of humble pie going, yeah, okay, which speaks a little bit to that expertise blindness, because her checklist of the sub-skills that we were asking students to complete was really very helpful in having us recognize why students were having difficulty with that simple assignment.
I would also say I've found the tool really helpful to move past this stuck spot that we find, kind of reactionary place that we find ourselves in, especially after we've been in higher education teaching for a while. We can really fall into this, those students, rawr. And I like how the RSD pretty concretely moves those conversations from those students just can't do it, those lazy Gen Zers, or whatever verbiage we use to decide that we're just in a stuck spot or in a standoff and we can't do it, to what interventions and choices can we concretely make to come alongside students instead of pitting ourselves against students. So that has been helpful as well, to get out of those kind of complaining loops, cathartic as they are.
I would have to say that one of the things the RSD does is takes a lot of the emotion out of all of the conversations you have across disciplines, within programs, just one person talking to another. It takes the "you're not doing this right" out of the conversation to, okay, let's take a look at where you are, and okay, so then what strategies can we use to make this better? And that's a way different conversation than you obviously are failing as an instructor, and let me show you how to do it better.
Right.
because that isn't the conversation. So it provides an opportunity to just say, okay, let's take a look at where we're at, and where do you want to be, and how do you get there? And by the way, here's a few tools that I found that might be helpful for you.
Mm-hmm. That I'm still learning how to use.
And me too.
Yeah. Any other questions about that? So before I take a look at the actual module and some of the resources we placed in there and the assignment that we've put in there, what are some things that are bubbling up of ways you might use this? Dustin, it's down to you, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, at least where I'm seeing this is a lot in just planning the course. So where are the students when they're coming in? What are they used to doing? And how, what types of autonomy are going to be the most valuable, and how can I push them into those areas?
Okay. If it were me, I see like a chopped up RSD taped on my whiteboard as I move around pieces. But I'm very tactile in some of my planning.
Yeah, that's, I don't know. I haven't started working on that exactly yet. I think that's part of the assignment that comes up this week. So,
Okay.
so yeah, I'll see how that process ends up working for me.
Okay. Well, let us know if you get kind of stuck and you're not sure how to move forward in it and through it, and we can always chat.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
And that goes to any of our listeners.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Dustin, one quick thing. Dustin, what you're trying to do, you're trying to get your students to be more independent in their thinking. Am I correct?
Yes, especially in so 2 things that I found where the students are weakest on. One is just asking questions, knowing, what is a researchable question and how to ask that, and then how to really start your own project without being told exactly what to do. And then secondly, kind of when they're in the middle of that, this is more the analyze and synthesize maybe. But so they can do an experiment and have a bunch of data sitting there, but if they're not told what to do with that data, they tend to get stuck.
Okay. So I'm trying a couple of strategies this semester in my own class that may or may not be helpful to you. And as we move forward, we can talk about it. I'll probably be posting it because it's going to be, I'm alpha testing the strategy this semester, and then I'll collect data next semester after I make some tweaks. But some of the same issues, and I hear that as a theme through a lot of my colleagues as well, is that students really aren't independent thinkers. So as you move forward, I'd encourage you to think about how and where your assignments fall into the red category.
Right.
And think about which ones you might be able to bump to the orange or yellow category. So that's kind of where I started. If you're interested, I'll be happy to share the techniques, but wait until the end of the semester, because we'll have to see how they go.
Sure.
It's either going to be really great or a total failure, one of the two, so we'll find out.
For the data issue, I wonder if you could approach it in the beginning or somewhere in the middle, like a constructivist, and maybe ask them, if you needed to know X, what types of evidence would you need to reveal that to you?
Right.
And then how would you gather that evidence? And once they've wrestled with having to construct that and consider, like, could we get that evidence? How would we get that evidence? Is it possible? Do we have to find another way to see that phenomenon? If they'll start thinking about their data as something that creates a picture instead of just numbers on a page.
Right.
And I'm not sure how to translate that into a physics realm, or if you even would want to. I would think you would want it at least close, so they can bridge, they can transfer that idea a little bit more firmly.
Yeah, I think that's actually pretty close to what I was thinking already, which is good to we're on the same page. Yeah, so things like there's one experiment that they do that has to do with light diffraction. But if I were to ask them, okay, now measure the width of a human hair, can they make that connection that, oh, I can do that with light diffraction, and the pattern will change depending on how thick the hair is and all those sorts of things. But yeah, I have to figure out exactly how to package that.
So
yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with.
Yep. So I think you will be really interested when we start looking at the framework for information literacy, because it will. I have found the RSD framework tells them what to do, but the FIL, the Framework for Information Literacy, speaks to why they should care.
Okay.
Puts that in context and helps reframe that a bit. So we should take a look at that a bit closer. That's where Jessie actually can be very helpful. She's the guru on the Framework for Information Literacy.
It will be a lot of testing and how to apply it. You can help me understand it better, I think, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Dustin.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we're just going to wrap up with a few details. The current module we're in is the 11.9.18 module. The next module doesn't start till 11.23, but you've probably noticed by now that there's a crossover of about 3 days to give you time to wrap up the first module, and then the next module opens up for people who are maybe kind of ahead of the game. And then our next meeting is on Tuesday, 11/27. That is a discussion-based meeting, and we'll be talking about the mapping that we're asking you to do during this current 11.9.18 module. And I want to give you a visual of what that looks like, because we've put some resources in here that I just want to point out so you notice them and take advantage of them. So right now, here's our online meeting. I'll put that recording here when it's ready to go. Here, we're asking you to choose one learning assignment or learning activity and identify the levels of autonomy. So do some mapping yourself using any kind of artifact you use to scaffold or teach. So it could be a PowerPoint lecture. You might actually kind of script out things you usually say and map it. Obviously, your assignment props are a prime place to do some mapping, but there are other ways. Maybe you have videos or something embedded in your LMS because you flipped it a little bit. Any of that is great to start with a mapping activity. You don't have to choose all of it, but you might. So do a little bit of mapping of what is happening, what you see when you look through the kind of androgynous lens of the RSD. And then you'll want to take out your assessment after. So ignore your assessment in the first part, then take out your assessment and map it and compare and see if you're asking the students to work at a higher, assess at a higher level than you teach it, or maybe even it's flipped. You're asking them to assess at a lower level than you actually are hoping that they're performing at. Sylvia has been super kind to work really hard on putting together, really hard, guys. She's awesome. Okay, so she has placed out 2 videos going through exactly how she has used the RSD to map an assignment, to map the related assessment, to be able to work through those examples with her. These are the exhibits or the downloads that you're going to need to grab as resources, because she'll reference them in those videos as she walks you through her process. And then she has provided kind of a worksheet that if you're kind of jiving with the way that Sylvia is thinking about mapping and doing mapping, you can download that activity worksheet and actually work through the steps. And she has placed in there actual numbering systems so that you can quantitatively measure
Yes.
the gaps, the levels of autonomy gaps. So you can use that if it is jiving the way you're thinking about it, but one of the best ways to really own the RSD for yourself is to construct your own way of mapping. And I've seen a lot of different ways of using that. So if you need some ideas, send me an email, send Sylvia an email, and we can play around with you with that. Okay? Okay.
Great.
Cool.
All right. So
Thanks
I
for
think
your kindness, Jessie.
that wraps up our Tuesday meeting.
Great.
Thanks for sticking with us, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin.
And hi to everybody who couldn't make it. We know you're out there.
Have fun.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.